In this lesson, we'll cover the fundamentals of Vray for Sketchup using this simple scene. We'll start with the toolbars. Vray for Sketchup has 3 floating toolbars here, and each icon is a shortcut to a tool or feature of Vray for Sketchup. Let's go ahead and start by clicking on this icon here for adding a plane light. We'll go over to the side of the model here, and this works like the rectangle tool. Click to draw a light, and then take your move tool to move that light up in the blue direction. Make sure that you point the white face of the light back towards the chair. And then click on your Scene tab to get back to the original view. Next, click on this icon here to open the V-Ray Asset Editor. The Asset Editor is going to be used quite a bit during the training. It has 4 tabs across the top left here. One is for materials, another for lights, another for geometry, and this gear icon here for settings. There's also a button here for rendering, and another one here for turning on and off the V-Ray frame buffer. We'll get into all of these things soon, but for right now, click on the gear icon, and we want to make sure that in the render category here, that our interactive render slider is on. Now, what we'll do is go ahead and start our very first render by clicking on this button here, which starts the render, and we can see it's the interactive mode. That's what the finger icon is. Go ahead and click on it. It will launch the V-Ray frame buffer where the render is happening, and it'll launch another little progress window here telling you that things are going on. I'll go ahead and minimize this window here and bring the frame buffer back up. So right out of the box, by adding the one light, we have this render going here. Now it's not bright enough, so let's go fix that. Click on the Asset Editor to bring it back to the front, and click on the light bulb icon to switch to the Light tab. Now you notice here that there's a list of lights in the model. The sunlight that comes along with SketchUp is actually disabled right now. You can tell by the grayed down icon here to the left. The somewhat brighter icon beneath it is for the V-Ray rectangle light. That's the one we added, and it's enabled. To increase the intensity of this light, make sure this line is selected by clicking once, and then click on the little arrow here for a flyout window. This gives you some extra things you can do to that light. We'll concentrate on the intensity. Here you see it says 30, and there's a slider to the right. Try sliding that slider to the right, and notice what happens in your frame buffer. You have brightened the scene up considerably. Back over in the Asset Editor, what happens if you need this to be brighter? Well, even though this slider seems to go only up to 100, you can actually type your own value here. Notice it says that there's a min-max when you hover over it. So click to highlight the intensity and try typing 400 and hit enter. Notice the slider resets so that you have quite a bit more room to work with. And if you click on the underlying frame buffer, you notice that you're pumping quite a bit more light into the scene. Once you've set up your lighting for a scene, you can turn your attention to the materials. By default, the walls, floor, and chair all just have SketchUp's default white material on it. Let's go ahead and change that. Go ahead and click on the V-Ray Asset Editor, and we can fold in this window here, and switch over to the Materials tab. You can see the material list, it's empty. We have to add our own material here, and let's go ahead and do that by clicking on this bottom left Add Material icon. It will give us a selection of the type of material we want to pick. Let's go ahead and pick generic. Although we've created the generic material, it is not yet being applied to our model. So let's go ahead and apply this generic material to the chair. The easiest way to do that is to open your outliner in SketchUp, select the chair group, and then back over in the V-Ray Asset Editor, right-click on the generic material and pick the option for Apply Material to Selection. You'll see that your interactive render restarts, and your chair is now rendering with that generic material. We have the option to go back over to the Asset Editor, and for the generic material, click on the Quick Settings tab, And here we can change some settings about that material. For example, we can change the diffuse color. I'll slide this to the right a bit to lighten that gray. And of course there are other settings here too. We'll wait to change any of these until a future example. Now, in addition to creating your own materials, as we did here with the generic material, V-Ray gives you a material library. If you click on this arrow here to the left, you'll see a flyout menu of pre-configured materials that you can add to your V-Ray project. Click on the concrete folder, and then scroll this slider all the way down to the bottom concrete simple G01 4 meters. We'll want to add this to the wall behind our chair. To do that, go back to your outliner and click on the wall group to select it. Then come back over to your asset editor. Now we want to drag this concrete simple material into our material list for this project. So go ahead and do that. And go ahead and right click on it in the material list and pick the option for Apply Material to Selection. Click on your frame buffer and you'll see that that material has loaded behind the chair. As it's rendering though, I can see that there might be something wrong with the scale. V-Ray tells me the scale. If I click on the asset editor, I see that it says 4 meters. So I can change that by going to SketchUp, opening the Paint Bucket tool to get access to the Colors or Materials browser, click on the house icon to see colors in model, and then click the Edit tab or double click to get into the Edit Material mode. There, I can change the width to 4 meters and click in the height area. It should change automatically. Then click Close and check out the difference in the frame buffer. Now let's repeat the same steps for the floor. So in the outliner, select the floor group, then come back over to the V-Ray asset editor, and in the concrete folder, scroll up and let's find one of the flooring options. I'll pick concrete flooring HO1 2 meters, click and drag that over, then we'll apply it to the selection. And once again, let's be sure that we get the scale right by editing the width and the height. And we can see now with these darker materials, perhaps the lighting should be a bit higher. So we'll do that in the asset editor, on the light tab, select the rectangle light, and let's change the intensity to 800. Then take a look at the frame buffer, and let's let V-Ray render this as our final pass for this first part of the lesson. Now so far, we've been using the interactive rendering mode. In the V-Ray toolbar, notice this icon here for locking the camera orientation. This tool allows you to navigate in your SketchUp model without affecting the rendering view. This can be particularly helpful if you want to move the position of the light, for example, and see what kind of change that would have on your rendering. So the interactive mode is useful for getting real-time feedback about your lighting, materials, and other things that you're doing in your model. Let's go to the V-Ray asset editor and click on this icon here to stop the interactive render. Then let's click on the gear icon and let's take a look at the progressive render setting. First, we'll need to turn off the interactive, which will default to progressive turned on. You'll notice a new slider here below called the quality slider. Right now, let's go ahead and slide it over to draft mode, and then go ahead and click the render button. Similar to interactive mode, the progressive mode renders the image in progressive passes. It's not updating in real time, so you can orbit around the model and do things, and you'll have to re-click on this button to render the new scene each time. However, an advantage that progressive gives you over interactive mode, go ahead and click on V-Ray Asset Editor, is that you can have some controls over the quality that you might not have with the interactive mode. Let's go ahead and flip out this flyout menu here and drop down the ray trace option here. Notice when you slide the quality slider to the right that you also are changing the noise limit here. So the quality is just a high-level simple control that is actually dialing more complex things underneath the hood. Now let's see what this would look like. But first, over in the frame buffer, click on this tool so that you can click and drag out a square for a region render. V-Ray will only render this region. Then back in the asset editor, let's switch the quality slider up to high and click render. And you can see that the rendered region is a lot less noisy at the higher setting. In the asset editor, note too that some of the other underlying tabs are affected as well when you slide the quality slider around. We can also see here that the GPU acceleration is activated. It's not on, but it's now able to be used. We're going to talk about that later, but just to note that that applies to progressive rendering. Now, one more mode yet to talk about is bucket rendering. For bucket rendering, we need to switch off progressive, and with interactive and progressive both switched off, by default, that will enable bucket mode. Now we'll do a few more things. We're going to set the quality slider back to draft, and back over in the Vray frame buffer, let's go ahead and disable the region render. Then let's go ahead and click render. As you could see, the whole image rendered in a series of buckets. Now, an advantage to this mode over the others is that with interactive and progressive, the entire scene has to be held in your computer's RAM. So if you have a very complex scene, as we'll see later with lots of displacement or other things that take up a lot of RAM, then it can take quite a bit longer for interactive or progressive to process the image. Whereas with bucket, you only need RAM for each individual bucket as it renders, and then it moves on and uses RAM for the next one, and so on. So we'll use bucket mode to create a final rendering of this scene. In the asset editor, let's go ahead and set the quality to very high. Let's also go and fold out this render output tab, and we'll set our image width to 1280. When we click here, it will update the other by the 16:9 aspect ratio here. We also have the option to turn on the Save Image feature. Let's roll this down and click on the File icon. Here we'll be able to choose a place to save our final image and click Save. And one last thing before we render, we have this small little facet here that still needs a material. So remember how we do that. Let's go over to the outliner, fold down the scene, pick the wall facet, then click on the asset editor and switch to the materials tab. There we'll use the same concrete simple G01. So go ahead and select it, right click on it, and pick apply material to selection. Then go ahead and go to the top button here and click render, and V-Ray will render your final image. Once your rendering has finished here in the Vray frame buffer, let's take a look at a few last things you can do to it. Across the bottom of the toolbar here, there's this H icon for the history window. Go ahead and click on that. And off to the side here, it will open a preview for your history bar. Click on this little power icon here to enable the VFB history. Now, one of the first things you have to do, click on this icon here, and we'll have to specify a history directory. Go ahead and click here, then pick a place on your hard drive and create a folder for the VFB history, and then click OK. Next, let's save the image that we have here in the frame buffer to the history. Go ahead and click on the small disk icon here to save it. Now let's see what it would look like to make a change to this rendering. I'll go back over here into the asset editor, make sure I'm in the material tab, and click on the generic material, and then go over to the quick settings tab, and let's change the diffuse color of the chair. So we'll click on that swatch, and in this color wheel here, I can slide the slider over. I'm going to pick something that's a little bit in the yellow range, and I'll slide this slider over too to make it a little bit lighter and brighter. Then I'll click on the settings gear icon. I want to toggle off the ability to save an image here since we're just dealing with the history right now. And then I'll come back over to the frame buffer. Now, so that I don't have to render the entire image again, I can click on the region render button and just draw a region around only the chair. Now I'll move the frame buffer down and click render. Now once the change has rendered, you can go over to the history and click the save icon, and it will save a version of the image that has the yellow chair. Now this makes it easy to switch back and forth between the gray version if you double-click, or the yellow version if you double-click on it. You'll also notice in the history there's a 1 and a 2 assigned to the pictures, which means you can switch back and forth using the 1 and 2 keys on your keyboard. This is a great way to assess small changes in your rendering by flipping between the options. Okay, let's say I like this yellow chair version. I'm going to clear this region render by clicking on the button. And I want to click on this button here to show corrections control. This will give me a new flyout to the right. And over here on the right, I have some options to use the frame buffer to make some edits to the image. I'll start by checking exposure and twirling down this menu to get at the underlying handles. I can click to drag exposure to the right or to the left to brighten and darken the image. I can do the same here with highlight burn. Notice how it's different also when I click on contrast and drag it around. So I'll adjust the settings here to get something that looks interesting to me. Next we'll cover white balance and also hue and saturation. So I'll check on white balance and twirl down its menu. Here I can slide the slider to try to make my whites a little more white. And I can check on hue and saturation and twirl down its menu. If I click on hue, notice I can change the color of the chair almost entirely. I'll slide that back over towards the yellows. Saturation, I can brighten up the colors a bit. And lightness, I can darken and lighten some of the areas. Notice as you change things too, you may need to go back and adjust previous color corrections. Ultimately, slide these sliders around to something that suits your tastes. And then when you're all done, click on the Save Image icon here. This will allow you to save an image, choose a location, name the file, and click Save. And in the end, if I open up both images here, I've got this yellow one that I've pulled over to the side, and there's the original one behind it. You can see the color corrections on the yellow one. A lot more contrast, obviously the yellow chair. So really brightening up the image here right at the end.